I will introduce our final keynote speaker. And by the way, hang out after this because there will be a wrap-up, an official wrap-up from SDN and an after party and happy hour, so definitely stick around. Our final speaker is Benjamin Evans, who is a design executive at Airbnb, focusing on product inclusion. He uses design to tackle issues like racism, sexism, bias, and he'll be talking about how to create inclusive products and services. This keynote, since it's the last one, it will be the full hour, and Benjamin will have a talk for part of it, and then the second half will be the Q&A. So please feel free to keep the Q&A section going, and we'll be able to take your questions after his talk. And with that, I will take it over, hand it over to Benjamin.
Good afternoon, evening, morning, wherever everyone is. Just gonna have a 2-minute to quickly set up, and I will be right with you. Okay. So yeah, hopefully everyone can see my screen. Where we're going to start off, I'm actually going to be telling you a couple of different stories about how me and my team are actually learning to tackle systemic issues like racism and sexism and other forms of bias. Along the way, I'm also going to be sharing a framework that you can use within your own products and services. And so to get things started, when I was a child, there was a belief that I used to have. That's mainly that if you reject me because of the color of my skin, then you are a bad person. That's what I used to believe. And that's because the first time that I was ever discriminated against, I woke up on the floor bleeding. See, a group of white kids had heard that Black kids don't feel pain. And so they had picked up a rock and thrown it at me and hit me squarely in the face. And the interesting thing about discrimination is that it's not the sticks or the stones that hurt the most, it's really the feeling of rejection. It's being made to feel like you don't belong. And since that day, belonging has really become a core part of who I am. Indeed, I spent a number of years traveling, and fast forward a lot of years till I was in my late teens, I was actually planning a trip. And I turned to Airbnb as a place to stay. And so I did what all guests on Airbnb do. I searched for homes, I checked for a calendar vacancy, then I sent a reservation request with a message to the host asking if I could stay. And what I expected to happen was that the host would accept me and welcome me. But what actually happened is that I sent a message, I sent the request, and I was rejected. But I didn't think too much of it. So I went to my second choice, checked that the calendar was vacant, and then I sent the message again. And I was rejected again. So I tried again. Same message, I'm here for a short vacation, can I please stay with you? And I was rejected again. And every single time it just didn't quite make any sense. You see, I was a verified user, I have the money to pay, my calendar and their calendars are free, so why am I being rejected? And I began to feel that familiar sense that it was something to do with the color of my skin. On a whim, I decided to ask a friend of mine who is white to send the same message on the same dates to the same hosts. And they were accepted immediately. See, as a company, Airbnb believes in belonging. But the reality is that guests of color, people who look like me, still struggle to get accepted. And so how do we bridge this gap between present day reality where people are often excluded and marginalized? And how do we bridge and bring people to this future, building a service where everyone can belong anywhere? Can we build a service that does this? Well, my name is Benjamin, and I lead design for Airbnb's anti-discrimination team. We were a team created to answer that question. My team's mission is to ensure that all guests and hosts have equitable access to amazing experiences. But within that, there's kind of the overwhelming question is, where do you begin? How do you even begin to use design to redesign a service around reducing discrimination and building inclusion? And the first thing that people often say whenever I say that this is a problem that we're solving is that we should just remove profile photos. And it makes kind of sense. If a host can't see your face, then how can they reject you because of the color of your skin? But Airbnb is a platform that is built on trust. And numerous studies have shown that profile photos, images of human faces, help create the trust needed for communities to thrive. And in the early days, the cost of taking away profile photos from our community felt too high. So we turned to a number of experts to try and find some other solutions, ideating with them, trying to find ways that we could redesign product to increase acceptance of marginalized and historically underinvested groups. And immediately we ran into a conflict. Although we had a lot of ideas, because there's no precedent for using product to tackle discrimination, there was no consensus as to what a solution could look like. Indeed, many of the ideas contradicted one another. Like one group would say, no, you should remove all information that may trigger discriminatory behavior. And another group would say, actually, no, you should add more information, add information that can override bias. Maybe you can build commonalities. And so an example of that is on the left, this is a guest profile. Like this is a profile stripped of the majority of personal information, like profile photos, last names, about me content. And on the right-hand side, this is us adding a lot more information, giving some more personality so that maybe someone viewing your profile on Airbnb can see commonalities that they can build, overriding any innate bias or discriminatory feelings that they may have. So what do you do? Well, as a product team, we chose that we were going to take a customer focus. We were going to go where the pain is most pronounced. And so we really zoomed in on the customer experience, the entire user journey, from the moment that you imagine booking somewhere to stay on Airbnb, all the way through to what it's like when you've completed your trip and come home safely. And from there, we decided to zoom in even further, looking for key parts of the product experience within this journey that we could potentially make more objective, remove triggers for bias, remove triggers for discrimination, add commonalities. And we tried a number of different experiments. Everything from removing last names, because there sometimes can be name bias where we see a name that is unfamiliar to us. We tried adding in commonalities, seeing if we can help people understand that they are more alike than they are different. We also tried finding ways of highlighting more objective signals, like trust signals, reviews, star ratings, so that we can get people to rely on objective information as opposed to more subjective criteria when assessing who to stay. We tried in the first 18 months, some 30 plus experiments to try and boost acceptance of guests of color, and nothing was having the effect that we expected. We felt stuck. We needed to find something, anything that worked. And so we turned to one of our bigger bets, an experiment where we removed profile photos. We went back into the product experience and across the user journey, found these key moments where we could remove profile photos across all of these key product surfaces. So that now, whenever a host were to receive a reservation request from a guest, they would not see a photo, no profile photos at all. However, something within this experience just did not feel right. Because if we zoom out and look at the entirety of this journey, that if a host is consciously and explicitly rejecting guests based upon the color of their skin, and we remove profile photos, then we're asking our host community to make a blind decision about who they're letting in. And what happens when a guest arrives at the home and the host sees for the first time that they are a person of color? Will removing profile photos push this online rejection into an in-person confrontation? See, my team has to be very careful and cautious as we design experiences across the platform, because the worst thing that happens if we get something wrong is not something like property damage. It could be something as severe as a hate crime. So we needed a solution. We had to find a way to try and reconcile this conflict. And I went home one of those nights and ended up sitting up late, and I ended up doing what I'm sure a lot of us do when it's late and we can't find a solution and we can't sleep. I ended up browsing Instagram. And there I received a message buried within my one of that other inboxes. And it was from someone who had seen a post where I had announced the kind of problems that I was tackling at Airbnb. And they said that, you don't know me, but he said, I don't know if you remember me, but we went to school together. And as we got talking, it turned out that he was one of the kids who had thrown a rock at me when I was a kid. And he apologized. And he said to this day, he doesn't quite know why he did it. He said he felt like he was scared, but he doesn't quite understand why. And that really stuck with me, that, what if my beliefs about people who discriminate are wrong, or at least incomplete? See, whenever we think of the kind of person who discriminates, we often think of someone who is explicit and conscious of their hatred. But I want to play just a very quick puzzle. I know that a number of you can't be interactive within this, but I just want you to do this in your mind for me. It'll take a couple seconds. I'm going to show you an image, and I just want you to count out to yourself how many triangles you see within this image. And I'll give everyone about 5-6 seconds, but just hold a number in your head at the end of it. So here is the image, and just take a couple of seconds, count out how many triangles you see in this image. Great. Now, I hope at least some of you have a figure that you've counted out. Part of the reason I love this game so much, this puzzle, is that there actually aren't any triangles present within it. It's a wonderful example of the fact that our brains are very adept at shortcuts, at connecting dots. It shows that we all have bias. And to anyone who doesn't know, bias is a series of shortcuts that our brain makes in order to help us navigate a world in which we are overwhelmed with information. Now, they're designed to keep us safe, they're amplified by stress, and they guide every single decision that we make, often without us knowing. Now, when we think about the kinds of decisions, well, one example is how about a decision about who you will host to your home? See, something that our service does is a host receives a request from a guest, someone that they do not know. Then they have to make a decision under stress about whether or not to accept this person or not. And the home is the most intimate of spaces. And we've all been biased since childhood to both fear the unknown and trust the unfamiliar. We've all been conditioned to view people of color as the unknown, as a source of fear. Up until last year, if you were to do a Google search for 3 Black teenagers, you would get predominantly mugshots in Google Images results. And on the right-hand side, if you were to Google 3 white teenagers, you would get happy families and stock photos. And this was only fixed last year, and there are hundreds of more examples where people of color are marginalized, are othered, are painted as the unknown, as a source of fear. And we realized that the primary problem that my team is solving is not one of explicit discrimination. It's one of implicit bias that's triggered by fear of the unknown. When we bring this understanding back to our work to do with profile photos, this experience, we realize that the solution is not to solely remove information that triggers discrimination or to add information that overrides discrimination. It's not one or the other, it's both. We have to find a way to balance people's biases by showing them the right thing at the right time. Now, with this new lens, we took another look at the role that profile photos play. And this time, when we reimagine this new experience, in pre-acceptance states, that's when a host receives a request to stay from a guest, they do not see a profile photo. That way, we've removed a trigger for implicit bias, and we've helped them make a more objective decision. Then if they accept the guest, and only if they accept, we bring the photos back, creating trust and familiarity, bonding over that. And this is something that we realize can be applied to a lot of the services that we build. We need to show the right thing at the right time if we are to optimize for inclusion, if we're to find ways to help people see past their differences. So we worked on a launch plan for this. But a couple of weeks before rollout, there was a big and a really unexpected problem: resistance. See, even though we had data to show that this wouldn't negatively impact key metrics, there were a lot of concerns internally with other teams and leadership about this course of action. Now, to be clear, all of the company believes in belonging. It is our highest value. But there was this gap present between this mission that we hold and the actions that we know and understand and are willing and enthusiastic about taking to further this. You have to understand that as a company, we are in hyper growth, expanding across every direction, across multiple markets. We're at this point in time with over 3,000 employees, 50 product teams, hundreds of launches, and all of whom have different OKRs, different key results, slightly different missions, and that sometimes can put us into conflict with one another. So we know that Airbnb is large and complicated, but what people often don't know is that all of our teams also work in these self-contained units. They can be grouped according to surface ownership. For example, one team might own the profile photo services, part of our digital platform, but another team might own the booking experience. Some team may own our entire payments portal, whereas some may handle offline marketing. Others may be focusing on design ops. So there's a lot of different intersecting teams who have to collaborate in these moments. And although we do have some teams who are dedicated to inclusion, ownership and responsibility over inclusive choices isn't yet operationalized. It's still siloed amongst teams like mine or Michael Su's digital accessibility team or our in-home accessibility teams. And as my team was working to ship product changes to try and remove barriers to belonging within product, we realized that we hadn't actually done any work to remove barriers within culture. And that meant that whenever we tried to ship a project or a change that was different, that prioritized the needs of a historically underinvested group of the other, of edge cases, as some people call groups of people who fit outside of the average experience, as we call it. Of course, we all know there's no such thing as average, but whenever we try to focus and champion the needs of these groups, we would get this low-level pushback. It would be harder to ship our projects than we expected, and we just didn't know why. We realized that we started this process by taking this customer focus, this front of house focus. We went where the pain is most pronounced. But what we realized is that we need allies. We can't do this work alone. And we can't change product in this way without also working to change culture. So we went backstage. We changed our focus in the midst of this. And we took a deeper look at the processes and our systems and the artifacts, trying to understand how do we work together and what are the barriers to inclusion? What are the silent things that are preventing us from being able to ship and move forward towards our mission in a cohesive way? We did a lot of interviews with our cross-functional partners and other teams, trying to understand what are some of the barriers to inclusive decision-making. And some of them that came up were really candid and quite just very, very honest. Some people would say it's slow, which is true. When you're trying to make more inclusive choices, you need to include more people in the process, which can slow down things. Some people would say it just doesn't affect me. It falls outside of their sphere of understanding. And so it presents something that is quite alien, and they couldn't quite connect a reason why they should prioritize one group when there are so many groups. Some people say that they don't know where to start. So we identified that there are knowledge gaps and awareness gaps, potentially even incentive gaps that are present within the way that we operationalize and we design and move forwards as a team, as well as things like there's not enough resources. We all know as working professionals that there's never enough time or resources to do every single thing. And so we have to prioritize. And in those moments, we would find that it is easier to prioritize the known, the projects that we know will either boost revenue or have an immediate effect on our metrics than it is about things that potentially are longer term, but that we know will do good for our community. And the interesting thing that came out underneath all of these reasons is that although we are united in our desire to do good, our desire to build belonging, underneath all of these was bias. The same kind of bias that, when present between our customers, results in in-person unintentional discrimination, is also present within our staff and the employees and our processes. We have a bias towards the status quo. We liked having profile photos So we resist letting them go. As designers, they look pretty. So there was a natural resistance to this kind of change. Inclusive design and inclusive decision-making takes more effort. So we were defaulting to the path of least resistance. And when we looked at all of these things together, we realized that this is why we're feeling a resistance to the work that we're doing. This is why it's harder to ship and why people have more fears than we would expect them to. We realize that we cannot build inclusive services until we confront our own biases. And something that we also realize is that the problem is not that we actually have bias. Often we talk about bias generally in the world as though it is this inherently bad thing, but it does have its benefits, and it's an essential part of what makes us human. So in this world, we have to realize that the problem isn't that we have it, it's that we often don't realize its effects until it's way too late. To give an example of this, whenever, I'm sure many of us know the human-centered design process. Whenever we go to ship a product or a service, we try and place a human at the center, a human need, and then we research, we ideate, we prototype, we launch, and we iterate with a human need at the middle. But Kat Holmes' wonderful quote from Kat says that the problem with human-centered design is that no one says which human to place at the center. And so all of these biases that we carry around with us, these essential components of who we are, lead us to place ourselves in the center of this process. And so human-centered design actually becomes self-centered design. And before we know it, we have built and baked our biases into the products and services we create and scaled them out to millions. And that's how you end up with algorithms that are unable to detect Black faces, self-driving cars that are more likely to hit people of color, pay gaps that exist even on digital platforms. And so we realize that our goal is not to remove bias. We can't do that. We can call upon some of our earlier learnings about showing the right thing at the right time. We have to find a way to help people actually be more conscious of their biases earlier in the process, so that they're then able to make more inclusive choices. How do we do that? Well, one of the insights that we actually had came from Tony Fadell. He's one of the original creators of the iPod. He said that the first secret to great design is noticing. So we needed to find a way to help more people notice, to be more aware of their biases earlier in the process. And so Anne Diaz, one of our lead researchers, actually led the creation of a tool that I hope everyone who's listening in will be able to take and use within their own companies. It's called Another Lens, and it is a set of questions that anyone in any discipline can ask that can help balance bias. It can help us consider the opposite of our assumptions so that we can all embrace a growth mindset, the growth mindset that's necessary to really make inclusive product choices. And it's really simple. It's a series of questions. Questions like, what are my lenses? What is your perspective on the world? What are the defaults that you bring in? A workshop that I did with this last week, we actually used it to take stock of where we as individuals within a design sprint were starting from. And so we used it through the lens of our own identities, like I'm Black, I'm a man, like I speak English, I'm in my 30s. Simply by listing out all of these attributes, these facets of our identities, helps everyone in the room understand what are the biases that we're bringing in, what are the perspectives, the lenses that we're bringing to this project. It's a great way to level set, because then what you can do much later in your process is look back and start questioning, like, have I brought these biases in? Am I giving disproportionate weight to maybe the needs of people like me versus people who I perceive to be different? Another one is who might be impacted by what we're designing. This is another way of helping you really think longer term about the way that we create services for and with a community. Let's consider the downstream effects of what we do, not just the immediate potential short-term financial gains. What are the details here that might be unfair? This really forces us to think, who are the people who may be disproportionately affected? Is there any injustices that may be created, any inequity that what we're creating could be allowing to happen? And one of my favorites, who are we missing? This is arguably the question that I use the most, asking it in every product meeting that I possibly can, because it draws attention, not just from a user side, who are the customers and the user groups who maybe fall outside of our defaults, the people who we are unintentionally forgetting. It also helps us think about our teams in the room. looking to your left and to your right and asking, who are the people? What are the identities that are not represented here? Be they something to do with gender, race, or be it more to do with things that are functional. Like, do we have a truly cross-functional team, or is it all designers or all engineers? So what does success look like if we start using this framework in more of our rooms? Something we started doing was, once we'd created this framework, we started bringing it and sharing it with different teams all over the company, really as many as we could. And the goal was just to give this lighthearted, playful way of getting people curious about themselves, about their biases, about what are these invisible things that may be limiting or constraining our ability to innovate inclusively. Some of the projects that came out of this way of thinking is like, this is to do with a set of accessibility filters. When you're looking for a home on Airbnb, you can choose the features. But up until around about 18 months ago, we didn't have any features that would allow you to search if you needed specific accessibility needs, like step-free access or a wide path to the entrance of a doorway. So again, asking the question, who are we missing, but applied to our search filters, it became apparent that there are a lot of people who we wanted to empower to be able to travel, but we hadn't built our service in a way that actually did that. And so we launched a set of accessibility filters born out of this way of thinking. In the first year alone, it had nearly 3 million users, which speaks to that we tapped into a need that is present within a vitally important community that was not being represented or honored up until these things were launched. In our marketing teams and our partnership groups, we started seeing more and more people reaching out to, beyond our typical partnerships and into like civil rights groups and privacy experts, so that we're building this shared accountability for actually building equitable services, for building services that are privacy focused as well. We also saw a redesigning of the illustrations of our platform. Jennifer Hom did this beautiful work in the corner where she has created an entirely new set of illustrations that actually represent people with a lot of diversity. And if you look at this image in the bottom left, you can see that within that singular image, which is just a keyframe of a guest arriving at a home, that you have age diversity represented, you have gender, you have a certain form of physical constraint, there's a prosthetic limb in there as well. And this is all present. And to members of our community who have felt that they were unseen in the past, this helps us feel seen. It changes our community. It helps more people feel like they can be a part of it. And so the way that we really were assessing criteria, it wasn't tied to specific metrics. It was really based upon, are we seeing more and more people taking inclusive action? Are we seeing more and more people asking these questions and then carrying it through within their respective teams, so that over time we are creating more of a shared awareness of this work, a shared ownership over actually advancing our mission of inclusion so that we can build a world where people belong. Once we had put some more effort and started tracks of this work to do with everything really back of house, from our processes, systems to our staff, we then went back to front of house, because now it's time that we wanted to really revisit profile photos. We had a lot of consensus, awareness. People were understanding that in order to really build equitable access, building inclusive services, we have to be willing to sacrifice. And that's a belief that I firmly hold to this day, is that judge a company by what they're willing to sacrifice in service of their mission, so that it's not just lip service. And what we found is we launched the project. We launched the Profile Photos experience. It was over a Christmas break, and I remember panicking because I thought, I'm going to get a call from the CEO saying that, me and my team, we've broken the platform, we've destroyed the community, but none of that happened. What actually happened is that the experience itself worked. We increased the acceptance of not just Black guests, but of all guests. Bookings were up. And even more impressive is that when we ran an analysis on the reviews that people leave after they've completed a trip, we found that the guests in our treatment of the experiment were also having great trips, which means that we found a way to both neutralize bias, to balance that bias, to increase acceptance, and create great experiences without any negative effects to our core platform and services. Now, within this success story, There's also like a personal failure, learning of growth for me within this, that even though I believe in inclusion, and I fight to reduce discrimination and balance bias wherever I can, I entered this process, this team, with a very strong bias against anyone who I felt could even potentially be discriminating. I kind of viewed them and judged them through a specific lens. And what this process is teaching me is that if we really are to design inclusive services, we kind of have to start by not judging people for their different beliefs. We have to try and enter as product professionals, as service professionals, as business professionals. We have to enter these spaces, giving people the benefit of the doubt so that we can try and understand where they're coming from. And so earlier in start of the talk, I asked, how do we bridge this gap between today's reality and our vision of a world where anyone can belong anywhere? And to me, we're still learning, obviously. This is just the beginning, but I believe one of the first steps we have to do is we have to own the problem. All of us who create, all makers, creators, designers, engineers, marketers, whoever you might be, we are creating things in service of an audience, if not multiple audiences. And unintentionally, we will often bake our own biases into these products and services and disproportionately affect exactly the people we want to serve. And we have to actually own the fact that this bias exists and own this problem, and then zoom in and zoom out so that we can get a good understanding of it and lay the foundation for us to then take action, that we can challenge our own biases so that we're better able to build more inclusive cultures and more inclusive products. I shared the Another Lens framework. You can find that online, and I encourage you to use it whenever you can. Let me know how it's working. We would love feedback. As I said, we are still on this journey and we're still learning. And finally, it is incredibly important that we build with people, not for. We have to partner with the individuals and groups that we seek to serve and bring everyone along for the ride. We can't do this alone. And we should avoid, wherever possible, this design savior where we try and solve problems with groups as though they cannot do it themselves. We need to bring people in as partners, building with them every step of the way. I firmly believe that design is one of the most powerful tools we have to drive positive change in the world. And to drive this change, we need to be willing to look beyond designers' pixels and pros and really challenge ourselves to confront our biases that hold us back, so that together we can build a world in which we all belong. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Benjamin. Gosh, I'm now realizing the constraint of virtual, because I feel like this deserves a massive round of applause, and I almost want to play a Mariah Carey song so we can get to the applause track at the end. Yeah. So let's assume everyone's clapping. That was so beautiful. Thank you so much for that. So we'll enter the Q&A portion. And I see some questions in the audience, in the chat, but please feel free to add more for about the next 20 minutes or so. So gosh, it's so inspiring to see, especially large companies, put that kind of deliberate effort into caring. I don't know, there's so many words. And it's actually especially interesting on the heels of what the talk a couple hours ago. We were talking with Ron Bronson about touch points and the shadow sides of different touch points and how it can create issues, how we're triggered and affected, and nobody's paying attention to it. So this is the complete opposite. It's like the very, very bright side of what it means when intentionality is put into everything. Now, what is the entry point to that? I mean, where do you start? How do you become that? How do you get to that level of what you're talking about?
When you say how do you start, do you mean from a like personal career, or like from a starting within a company?
Within like a company, I'm curious. What is the entry point? Yeah, about wanting to put that intentionality, especially at such an in-depth level, and especially with such a wide net of inclusivity? What's the entry point for?
Yeah, I mean, I think a good entry point is always on finding a problem. Just like, you know, most businesses and most, whether it be design or anything, design focused or anything, it has to start with a sincere desire to find a group whose needs are not being met. And I think we all have a lot of products and services that we either interact with or that we're directly involved with creating. And so one of the great ways to do this is, within whichever company you are, find a group whose needs are not being met in the way that the default needs are being met. And then you just have to find a way to elevate that group. If you have a dedicated research team, every time I've worked with the researchers, they've been wonderful in partnering and helping us find these qualitative insights with diary studies or whatever it might be. Or you may just have to get scrappy. Like in a previous company, I very much kind of would just hit the streets and find people who used our product and interview them and try and find out where are the edges that are not being met. Where's the rough sides that people's needs are not being met, they're not being seen. And then you just have to start bringing those into the company, bringing them into rooms. And you'd be surprised that simply through the act of sharing stories about people who want to use your product, but because it is not inclusive enough, can't. You'd be surprised how many people have a real sincere desire to change things for the better. It's just more often than not, we all have our own blinkers on. As I'm sure you know, we have our blinkers on. We have our KPIs, we have our metrics, we have our deadlines, and we don't have a moment to look up and look around. And so you can be that change in the company just simply by bringing those stories to the forefront, and you'll be surprised at how many people will rally alongside you. That to me is like the very first step.
Yeah, I like that perspective. I especially like that perspective because it challenges that, it goes beyond the idea of kind of falling in love with the problem. There's something about that never quite settled. But I prefer instead fall in love with the people, because when you do that, then you can have a better understanding of what their problem is, which might be different than what you thought it was.
That's exactly that. I agree completely. Yeah, falling in love with the people, and then also continually picking new groups to fall in love with as well. Because again, it could be very easy that once you've found a particular group who is at the edge of the experience, to almost focus exclusively on them, but you can challenge yourself to keep finding new groups. Yeah.
Well, excellent transition. I mean, how do you decide, right? There's so many people to serve, so much of a net to cast on inclusivity. How do you decide which groups to serve first or at the same time?
I mean, there's kind of like two different lenses you can apply to this. I think it was Carl Rose, who's an accessibility consultant, said the only things that drive change in business is something that decreases risk or increases growth. And so if you apply that lens to this work, you could find the group that by serving their needs, you will increase growth within the business, or find the group whose pain is so pronounced that by not serving them, it increases risk. I prefer looking towards the I don't want to say the optimistic side, but the side that favors a joyful, bringing more people in, inclusion side to it. But sometimes with a company, companies need a sharp shock. They need to see that by not catering to the needs of a specific group, there is a lot of at risk and a lot at stake. And so what I would normally do is I will look across all of these groups and find where is the pain most profound, or where is the joy most accessible, and then pick one of those. It's, you know, something I would also encourage people to do is to, of course, it's overwhelming, this work. There are so many different groups, and it can often feel like you're trying to boil the ocean. The most important thing that you should do is pick one group and start. Once you've done that, it becomes a lot easier to start branching out, because you get to prove that this way of thinking, this way of acting, making inclusive choices can actually yield a lot of benefits, both professionally and for the business.
Yeah, I like that. Just pick one group and start. Now you've described this from a perspective of an existing service, and you're seeing some of the biases and the results of it, and remedying them. What does this look like? How would you recommend catching and fixing these issues at the inception of a program
Diverse
or
teams.
a product?
Yeah, I mean, number one, as like table stakes, find a way to ensure that the team creating whatever you're creating is as diverse as possible. And that's not just about things like skin color or gender, that's also to do with things like age and ability. That can do with anything to do with like things like localization, non-English speakers. Like the more people that you can bring together, the more opportunities you have to actually innovate. Because one of the ways I love thinking about innovation itself is that innovation is really just the intersection of kind of two nodes. And where they intersect, that's where you get something interesting, like, you know, the phone and the computer, there's the iPhone kind of thing. And so the more diverse people that you have, the more identities that you have represented in the room, the more opportunities you have for this kind of innovation. So that's kind of like a table stakes. But then what I would also then do is what we, you know, when we're creating products, really anyone's creating products, we typically create a user persona. I'm sure everyone listening in knows what one of those are. But what we do is we create it and then we fixate on it, or we stop there. What we should be doing is creating more user spectrums where we're looking to identify, here are all of the people who possess a need for what we're solving. Not just here is, you know, John, who is in mid-30s, who is English speaking from America. It's like, well, no, that's just like one very narrow section. Like, who are all of the people who could have this? And so make a point of continually adding personas into this and then seeking out those people. And I think one of the most critical thing maybe that I keep coming back to is that you have to continually be building with a increasingly diverse set of customers, because they will tell you, you know, you don't have to know everything. They will tell you exactly where their needs, their specific needs are not being met. You just need to be courageous enough and vulnerable enough to actually continue to seek out that kind of feedback.
Yeah.
And it is scary.
Isn't it? Yeah. And it is a place of courage. I think as designers too, it's what we make is also personal. And so to have that challenge, and with that in mind, a great transition into a question. What's the biggest challenge in getting people to challenge their own biases?
The biggest challenge, I think, is people's existing relationship with people challenging their biases. There's like a lot of scar tissue because we've all done anti-bias training, I'm sure, and it's boring and it's tedious, or we read about bias in popular media, whether it's in newspapers or something, and to have bias is always framed to be this negative thing, that bias is the enemy. And so I find that one of the hardest challenges is getting people to understand that you're challenging their bias, but you're not challenging their identity. You're not shaming them for having biases. You're presenting an opportunity for growth. And that takes, you almost have to like help them shed that past scar tissue. And then once they understand that, oh, I have these things and you're helping me be aware of them. And by me being aware of them, I actually become better at my craft. Then you kind of get this wonderful transition point, but it sometimes does take a while to guide people to that.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's actually that's a good tie-in to something Antoinette Carroll said earlier, where she was looking at terms that we consider to be negative. They're actually neutral terms. Bias being one of them, power being one of them. At face value, it doesn't have to be negative, but it's made negative, and then we react to that.
Exactly. It's exactly that. And so all of those, preconceived, I'm trying to avoid not saying the word bias too many times, all of those existing biases we have about biases, those are some of the hardest things to call out. And I'd also say that trying to do this work within a climate where there is never, or an environment where there is never enough time or resources, because inherently to do this work properly, you have to slow down. And everything in the Western world, if not the world in general, is like, no, speed up. We have to ship more things. We have to ship it sooner. We're running out of money. We're losing opportunities. And inclusive design is very much asking people to act against their own natures of rushing towards things quickly.
Yeah. Although It's interesting. Slow down is also a relative term, isn't it? Like, what does slow down really mean? It doesn't necessarily have to mean spend 5 more years developing a thing. It might be
Yeah.
the difference between a few weeks, and that's okay. We can afford a few weeks.
Exactly that. And it's never, it really exactly what you tapped into there. It's the perception thing is where this becomes so
Yeah.
challenging, because simply by spending a day or two asking the kinds of questions that, we've been talking about, you can actually identify a lot of the obvious problems that will be present in your product when it gets shipped or as it's being created. So it really is not a lot longer, but it feels like it when the pressure's there.
Yeah. So something interesting that came up. Ooh, I don't know how to ask this. So every light casts a shadow. This is from the chat. How might the knowledge created to reduce biases, how might that be used by maybe what's the word? Not by unethical organizations or bad actors? Can it be
Might
used?
it be used? I mean, again, it's one of those things where I do believe that information is neutral, as you said. Like, terms are generally neutral. It's someone takes it to a bad place or not, and I think it's not that far off a lot of the dark design patterns that we see, the dark UX patterns. One of the things that I said in the talk is that one of the keys that we're finding to be able to build more inclusive services is about showing people the right thing at the right time. Well, who decides what the right thing is? And like, depending upon what you show will directly influence how someone feels or thinks. And so there are loads of ways that by either omitting information that people have a bias against or by adding information that people have a bias towards, you can shape behaviors. We saw this actually with Facebook last year, tweaking the newsfeed to show things. If they showed things that have more of a positive sentiment that you identify more with, you feel happier. And the reverse side things, that's playing into our own biases. We see the same thing when it comes to echo chambers across social media. Like, that is reflecting the content that we're shown. That is a reflection of our biases being fed back to us. So this is all rooted in the same simple psychology that we have as humans, that in design, I hope more often than not, we are trying to find ways to help people, to leave them better off through using our services than not.
Yeah, exactly. Let's see, I want to catch some more of the audience questions. How do you measure the relevance of research findings and user spectrums in order to show the company or the team what problems need to be prioritized?
I would, if I understand the question correctly, I would say that that is very much based upon what the metrics are in your particular company, because you'd be posing this specific user segment potentially against another segment. But I think that the overarching thing with inclusive design or about prioritizing different groups is that no matter what, it increases your market size. And so I can't speak directly to that without knowing like your specific company metrics, and even then it gets a bit fuzzy. But what I can say is, if we look to the broader world with specific groups that have historically been marginalized, let's say members of the disability community or people with disabilities, there are over 1 billion people in the world who have some kind of physical or cognitive constraint. And so if you're looking to grow your business, why not tap into a group that historically has not had their needs met in so many different ways? And I would bring that to the table as a way to say, here is a way or a reason to prioritize one group over another.
Mm-hmm. So how was your team built? What disciplines did you integrate into your anti-discrimination team?
Sure. So my team was created in 2016. There was a social media hashtag Airbnb while Black, and that was the experience of Black guests sharing their experiences of being rejected, very similar to the experience that I had on Airbnb. And that was a real rallying moment for the company. Like I said, Brian, our founder, like fiercely mission driven. And so the idea that belonging and discrimination can exist in the same world is incongruent. And so he came out with a public statement, and then internally, we all actually self-organized. This was just before I joined, self-organized a hackathon where we called on anyone across different disciplines to come together and let's see if we can ideate and build and ship solutions to the needs of a variety of different groups. Anne Diaz was a lead researcher at that time. She organized that, and then that then basically condensed into the team. And so, our leadership, of course, was fully on board with it. They needed someone to lead design, which is when they reached out to me. I was living in Vietnam at the time. And in terms of the makeup of the team, we are truly cross-functional. We have design, and we have researchers, we have data scientists, engineers, we have legal and policy representation. We also have customer support. So we have a lot of diversity of function, but then also a lot of diversity of identity. So we have people across genders. We also have across different races. Me, myself, I'm an immigrant. So we have age diversity. We have a lot going on, and we're always trying to find more ways to bring more variety into what we do, because we believe it's an essential strength, and it's proven to be a source of strength for us continually.
Yeah. You said that's interesting with the hackathon as a basis for the team. Was that self-selecting?
Yeah. And so it was, when we all became aware that things were blowing up, in essence, on social media, it called attention to a problem we didn't know existed. And so, luckily, gratefully, we're a mission-driven company, and so there was a lot of self-selection. Like, people just came together. And even if you Google back to 2016, you'll see that some of the outputs of that hackathon were also like large-scale photography exhibits. This is Airbnb, so we're not a photography company, so to speak, but there were large-scale exhibits telling Black stories, and so all of these kinds of things came out of that. But it just shows the power of giving people the opportunity to come together around something that makes them feel good. Inclusion is often all it really needs. People, I firmly believe people want to do good things. You just have to give them the right opportunity or help them find it.
Yeah, absolutely. The another lens tool that you presented, how do you have an ideal cadence for how often you use it or when you leverage it?
I would make a point of using it at least, if we're looking at a typical design process, just an example, make a point of using it at least once at the start of every one of those stages. What I like to do is to bake the questions into a one-pager. I don't know if one-page is common language for the audience. It's like a project spec that will cover all of the details about, what is a hypothesis, what will the experience be like, yada, 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 et cetera, et cetera. And so by baking these questions into the core foundation of how we're talking and thinking about the project, we make sure that we're then able to keep checking in. And whenever we look back to the one page to update it, the questions are there. So I would say a minimum of like once per stage, like once in the empathize stage, in the research stage, at a minimum. But honestly, the more times you can do it, the better. It is, I will say, candidly, it is tiring, because again, it requires you to keep flaring when what you're trying to do is to focus. But again, it trains a muscle. And over time, it gets easier and easier to just keep that lens up and to keep knowing when and how often to bring people into this process.
Yeah, that's interesting. Also, another one of the common themes, the kind of mental and emotional toll that it takes to be doing this work, and how do we address that and kind of not let that overwhelm stop us from doing it.
And I think that's a wonderful call out that you've, wonderful point that you picked up on and expressed there. And something I would actually really like the audience just to, know, and so I'll double down on it, is that this work requires emotional resilience, because you're doing the right thing, but there is no end point to it. Your product will never be inclusive. Your service will never be inclusive. You can only ever directionally move towards that. And so you have to find a way to really kind of balance your own emotional resilience, knowing that you're that this work will never be done, but just knowing that you are making a difference, even if it is not immediately apparent to you or the people who are right next to you. It does, everything that you do to try and be more inclusive does help.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that pointing in that direction at the very least for progress.
Yeah.
So if we think about maybe like the one thing, what is something that we can challenge the industry to do as maybe the one next thing? And this might be too broad of a question. I just like asking it because
it's a very broad question.
Yeah, but I'm very aware of what I'm asking. So you're welcome to put it in a different way.
We've just spoken about like expansive things. Like, what's the one thing we can ask the audience?
The next thing, let's say, the one next thing we can challenge people to do to take that first step, maybe if we frame it that way. Yeah.
Sure. I would keep coming back to my favorite question, which is getting people to ask, who are we missing? And you can do it yourself. And you can apply it to any circumstance that you are in. Because as humans, we have a bias towards exclusion. To say like 2 seconds more on that, like, as you navigate the world around you, you exclude far more people than you include. You have to. That's how we function. So, you know, we have our friends, we have our family, but everyone else we excluded. So our default is to exclude people. And so simply by continuing to asking those around us, whether it's our colleagues, like, who are we missing? Do we have, you know, enough representation in leadership? Do we have diversity of identity and experience in this room? When we're looking at researching with users and defining our users, like, who are we missing? We have our default that we have gone to, but then who are the other people? At least holding space. It allows you to hold space for these individuals in these groups, and holding space is kind of the first step to really being able to actually seek them out and bring them in. And over time, the more and more people you get doing this, the easier it gets. It's just a really simple tool a really simple question that I just really enjoy offering to people.
That's beautiful. Well, we'll take on that challenge and think about that. Who are we missing?
Wonderful.
Well, thank you so much for this, Benjamin. What an enriching talk and such a perfect way to wrap up this incredible day. Thank you so much for your insights and for the generosity of your knowledge.
Thank you to you. Oh no, I was just saying thank you to you as well, and thank you to everyone who gave their time to be here. I know it's a crazy time in the morning for some people, but I really appreciate you being here and listening in.
Yeah, we've had a wonderful group. I'm curious, is anyone still here? Has anyone been here the whole time? If you have, please shout out so we can send you all the high fives. So with that, I will bid everyone adieu and say thank you so much to the audience, to the speakers, to the SDN organizer team for inviting me to share this beautiful day with all of you. This has been truly an enriching experience and such the reminder that the design community is really special. It's, you know, going into a place where there's so much openness and so many inviting spirits. It means a lot. And I think we have so many amazing things ahead of us as a community at large.